August 2nd, 1867, and the mood here is grim. We're at the foot of the Bighorn Mountains in present-day Wyoming. A small group of soldiers have been cut off and surrounded by hundreds of mounted, charging Lakota warriors. Less than 8 months ago and only 3 miles away, these same warriors killed Captain William Fetterman and his entire 80-man command. Now the warriors are looking to repeat their victory. There's nowhere to run, so more than a few of the surrounded men take their shoes off and prepare to fight wearing only socks. They've tied loops with their shoestrings that allow them to put their rifle muzzles under their chin and pull the trigger with their feet. Nobody wants to be captured alive, and it's easier to get your foot through the loops without a shoe on. Only two things will keep the soldiers from using those shoestrings today: their firepower and 14 wagon boxes. Leading these men is 36-year-old Captain James Powell. Now, Captain Powell is one of these men whose story has almost been lost to history. It's tough obtaining details about his life. One of his commanders did describe Captain Powell's illiterateness and coarse profanity. We also know he carried around an extra set of balls. I should probably explain. James Powell had enlisted as a teenager just in time to ship off to Mexico and take part in the final stages of the Mexican War. He spent the majority of the 1850s in the cavalry and was eventually promoted to first sergeant. When the Civil War broke out, Powell was able to obtain a commission as a second lieutenant in the 18th U.S. Infantry. With this regiment, Powell saw combat in nearly every major battle of the Western Theater. Outside Atlanta, at the Battle of Jonesboro, the 18th Infantry was given the job of assaulting a tough Confederate position, and Powell was shot multiple times. He survived, but the surgeons weren't able to remove two Confederate bullets from his chest. The balls couldn't have been pleasant for Powell, who carried them around for the rest of his life. By late 1866, now Captain Powell rejoined his regiment at Fort Phil Kearny. Powell rode to the fort with another 18th Infantry captain, William Fetterman. At Phil Kearny, both officers got a brutal reality check. Red Cloud's War was in full swing. Although the year's fighting season was mostly over, warriors continued to harass supply convoys and steal livestock from outside the forts. Now, one of Fort Phil Kearny's vulnerabilities was its reliance on wood from the nearby foothills. This wood was used to construct the fort's buildings and stockade, as well as for cooking and heating fuel. These wood-cutting parties were easy targets for war parties. During one of these attacks, Colonel Henry Carrington, Fort Phil Kearny's commander, ordered Captain Powell to relieve an attacked wood train, which Captain Powell did without taking any casualties. 2 days later, Colonel Carrington ordered Powell to relieve another attacked wood train. But this time, Captain Fetterman claimed seniority over Powell and took command of the relieving force. That day was December 21st, 1866. After the complete destruction of Fetterman's command, Powell's soldiers were among the men who collected and buried what was left of their fellow soldiers. It was impossible to forget what the native warriors had done to the bodies. Fetterman's fight had put Phil Kearny's occupants into a frenzy of near paranoia. But the fort's main threat wasn't from the natives. They tucked into their winter camps for the rest of the season. No, the danger to the troops came from a different direction: the weather. Sub-zero temperatures were the norm for most of the winter, and no supply convoys made it up the Bozeman Trail. By the end of December 1866, the fort's post returns list 28 enlisted men as sick. By April, that number would balloon to over 90, nearly one-fifth of the fort's garrison. The chief complaint was documented in the post returns: health of the garrison not good, scurvy the prevailing complaint. Believe it or not, the men at Phil Kearny were suffering from the same ailment that plagued ocean-going sailors for hundreds of years. But it makes sense if you think about it. Both soldiers and sailors at the time ate the same food, mainly salted meat and hardtack, and that diet lacks the necessary vitamin C to prevent scurvy. On the ships, sailors were eventually issued lime juice that prevented scurvy. But frontier troops in the 1860s were only given vinegar, and a lot of the times the Army docks just didn't have that. It had been assumed the troops on the frontier would create gardens and have access to fresh vegetables that way, but that had not been a priority at Phil Kearny. One soldier at the fort recalled, "All the men that were at the fort at the time it was established got the scurvy. Some lost teeth and some the use of their legs. In the spring, when the grass came up, there were lots of wild onions, and the scurvy gang was ordered out to eat them." A civilian who had worked at the fort claimed he still suffered from the effects of scurvy years later. With the new year, the Army was reorganized, and Powell's company, Company C, 2nd Battalion, 18th Infantry, was now Company C, 27th Infantry. With spring's warm weather, the fighting season resumed. Red Cloud's War Part 2. Many of the soldiers at Phil Kearny were dispatched on missions throughout the Powder River country, things like escorting mail carriers and protecting supply convoys. These missions took up a lot of manpower because if you didn't allocate enough men, the phantom-like Lakota would strike, then disappear. In early April, a mail convoy was found near Powder River, with everyone killed and the mail scattered around the ambush site. In late June, a large band of Indians approached the fort, but these weren't Lakota or Cheyenne. They were 125 lodges of Crow and Nez Perce. The Crow had been at war with the Lakota and Cheyenne for who knows how long, and when Europeans entered the area, the Crow allied themselves with the newcomers, enemy of my enemy is my friend type stuff. Now, this may be a good place to point out that although the Lakota alleged that the military forts along the Bozeman Trail infringed on their land, according to the agreed upon 1851 Treaty of Fort Laramie, Lakota territory was actually further east, and the Crow tribe claimed the land west of the Powder River where the forts were. Just a little technical point that ultimately doesn't really matter. I mean, nobody followed that treaty's terms. The day after the Crow arrived at the fort, a Lakota war party stampeded the Crow's ponies. The Crows pursued the Lakota, recovered most of their ponies, and claimed to have killed 3 Lakota warriors. A detachment of cavalry and infantry went with the Crows to protect and encourage the friendly Indians. A few days later, the Crows left to hunt along the Bighorn River. The Crows weren't the only visitors to Fort Phil Kearny that summer. Just like any other government disaster, Congress is going to get involved, and they formed a special commission to investigate Fetterman's fight. Powell was interviewed by the commission on July 24th, and to make a long story short, his testimony, along with others, threw Colonel Carrington under the bus instead of Fetterman. Carrington really didn't appreciate this, and would later write a rebuttal to the commission about Powell's testimony. It's all political drama beyond the scope of this story, but it's fair to say it was probably a relief for Captain Powell when his 51-strong company left Phil Kearny at the end of July. It was his company's turn for their month-long rotation at the Pinery, guarding the woodcutters who were cutting wood for the fort. The Pinery was an area a few miles west of the fort at the base of the Bighorn Mountains. The woodcutters worked at an outlying site called the Side Camp, located on Little Piney Creek about a mile from the mule herd and corral. Civilian teamsters shuttled U.S. Army wagons to and from the Pinery. To make more room on the wagons, 14 wagon boxes were removed from their wagon chassis and placed on the ground in an oval. These boxes served as a corral. They were placed far enough apart so a man could walk between them, but close enough that the livestock couldn't. The soldiers pitched their tents a short distance to the south of the corral. Powell sends 12 men to guard the woodcutters and another 13 men to escort the wagons to and from the post. This leaves 26 soldiers and his recently arrived second-in-command, First Lieutenant John Jennis. 24-year-old John Jennis had spent most of the Civil War in a field artillery regiment guarding Washington, D.C. After the war, Jennis had secured a commission in the new 27th Infantry and had just been assigned to Captain Powell's company in July. Now, the side camp wasn't actually in line of sight of the corral, so a small OP, or what they called a picket post back then, was established on a knoll several hundred yards south of the corral. It was here that on August 2nd, 1867, Private Sam Gibson, at 18, one of the youngest men in the company, was assigned as a guard. After breakfast, Gibson was at his post when a fellow soldier first noticed hostile warriors coming down the hill. Lots of warriors. These warriors were mainly Lakota. After the annual Sundance, the Lakota and Northern Cheyenne were eager to take the fight to the army, but they couldn't agree on how best to do that. The Cheyenne wanted to attack Fort C.F. Smith in southern Montana, but the majority of the Lakota wanted to go back to Phil Kearny. The warriors decided to follow their hearts and attack whatever target they wanted. The Lakota chose Phil Kearny. At any rate, the war chiefs planned to use the same tactic that had led to their success against William Fetterman. Wait for the soldiers to fire their rifles, then bum rush the soldiers while they were reloading and overwhelm them in close combat. However, the warriors hadn't counted on one thing, and that's what Sam Gibson was holding in his hands. Just weeks before, Company C's soldiers had turned in their old muzzle-loading muskets and been issued brand-new breech-loading trapdoor Springfield rifles. The old muzzle-loaders could fire about 3 rounds a minute. These new rifles could shoot 5 to 6 times faster. By the way, anybody know the sustained rate of fire of today's M4 carbine? The Indian warriors who were attacking Powell's men figured that Powell and his guys would fight the same way that Fetterman and his men had fought 8 months earlier. Now, Fetterman's men had been equipped with muzzle-loading rifled muskets, similar to this guy here. Now, this is an older model that was refitted with percussion lock. This actually saw service in the Civil War. Shout out to Joe at Wyoming Traveler for letting me use this antique for this video. This thing's awesome. Now, the guns that Fetterman and Powell used were about this length. But Powell had an important advantage that Fetterman didn't, and that the warriors didn't know that he had either. One of the things that strikes me being behind this wagon box with this long of a rifle is how cramped it is. Me personally, I don't know if I'm getting inside this wagon box, and I don't know if being inside it gives you that much more cover than just being behind it. I think this would be the way to go. Gibson couldn't resist taking a shot at the warriors, but the picket soldiers quickly realized they were outnumbered and ran back towards the corral. So did Captain Powell, who had been bathing nearby in the creek. The warriors quickly overwhelmed the side camp, killing 3 soldiers and scattering the rest of the men into the nearby hills. A couple hundred mounted warriors ran off the mule tenders and seized the herd. Powell and Jenness quickly gathered their available men and distributed ammunition around the corral's wagon boxes. Gibson and his fellow pickets still have to run the several hundred yards toward the corral, dodging the warriors' fire. Fortunately for them, one soldier comes out to save them, Max Lippman, one of the company NCOs, who speaks almost no English. He lays down covering fire for the men as they dive into the corral. Gibson's afraid he's going to get chewed out by his commander for leaving his post without orders, but Powell tells him, "You have done nobly, my boy. You could not have done better. Men, find a place in the wagon boxes. You'll have to fight for your lives today." Within minutes, hundreds of mounted warriors surround Powell's command. He has 26 men, plus 4 civilians who were able to make it to the corral. Among them is R.J. Smith, an experienced teamster who had been at Phil Kearny since its founding. According to Smith, the soldiers in 1867 had learned from their previous fights with the hostiles never to run from an attack. The soldiers had better guns and were far better Indian fighters. They had learned that it was safer to keep their faces to the Indians than, as during the previous year, their backs. When you run from an Indian, you are his meat. That morning, Smith had gone deer hunting with his partner, but had seen the warriors in the area and was unable to make it back to the fort. He takes a position on the north side of the corral and lays out his weapons: 2 Spencer carbines and 2 revolvers. Next to him, Private Thomas Doyle, Tommy, stacks ox yokes in the gap between 2 wagon boxes. Gibson himself sets up behind a box on the south side along 2 experienced soldiers, Sergeant John McQuarrie and Private John Grady. Captain Powell and First Sergeant John Hoover take a spot a couple of wagon boxes to the west. Sergeant Lippman thinks the wagon boxes won't give enough protection against the hostiles' fire. He prones out on the corral's southwest, behind a salt barrel that he fortifies with a few ox yokes. Next to him, Private Jim Condon prepares to fight behind a barrel full of beans. Lieutenant Jenness mans an exposed position near a covered wagon on the west side. He notes a group of native onlookers on a hill to the corral's east, and says he thinks he can see Red Cloud preparing to watch the imminent battle on the hilltop. Sure he can, bud. Smith later recalled, "I told him to keep under cover." He stated he was compelled to expose himself in order to look after his men. Around the perimeter, men take their hats off and use them to hold extra ammo. The preparations are abruptly cut short by the Lakota warriors beginning their attack. Powell then yells one of the few orders he'll give during the entire fight: "Men, here they come. Take your places and shoot to kill." At the boxes, there's little to no talking. Max Lippman noted, "When we saw the hundreds upon hundreds of savage warriors pressing forward against our little improvised fort, not a man in the entire command expected to come out of that fight alive." Private Gibson remembered the look on the men's faces was not of despair or desperation, but one of intense earnestness and resolution. The Lakota's first assault against the corral is a mounted charge across the plain to the southwest. Remember the plan: let the soldiers fire and empty their muskets, wait for the ramrods to get pulled out, then quickly charge in and overwhelm them. But the warriors soon discover to their dismay that the pause in firing never comes. The Lakota bravely make it to 100 yards from the corral, but the intense fire from the corral forces them back. Gibson remembers, "They paid dearly for their daring, for we had a steady rest for our rifles. The Indians were all within easy point-blank range, and we simply mowed them down by scores." This was not part of the Lakota battle plan. The warriors pull back out of rifle range, but the plain is littered with wounded warriors. In Plains warrior culture, you don't leave your dead or wounded behind if you can help it. The soldiers are impressed by the horsemanship on display as the warriors snatch their wounded from the ground mid-stride. But the warriors don't leave. The soldiers can plainly see mounted messengers galloping back and forth and hear war cries. As Gibson put it, "We did not know what to expect, but we knew they would attack us again soon." Something desperate had evidently been determined upon by the savages. All we could do was to wait and watch. Not a word was spoken. It was a moment of suspense that was simply terrible. During one of the charges, someone shouts out about the tents. The soldiers' tents are standing and blocking their view of the approaching warriors. In Private Gibson's wagon box, John Grady yells at Gibson, "Come on, kid." Along with a few other soldiers, the two run to the tents and loosen their guidelines, causing them to collapse. As Grady and Gibson run for Captain Powell's tent, First Sergeant Hoover yells for them to come back. The corral can't spare the manpower. The Lakota now decide to switch their tactics up. A vulnerability in the corral's location is a steep drop-off a short distance to the north. Instead of another mounted charge, the warriors dismount and use the cover offered by this drop-off to get close to the corral. From its lip, sharpshooters can now target the soldiers. On the north side, R.J. Smith works his Spencers and revolvers, saving 2 rounds in his pistols in case the warriors breach the perimeter. In all my experience in fighting Indians prior to this time, I never saw them stand punishment so well as they did at this time. They certainly brought all their sand with them. Early on, Private Henry Haggerty is shot through the left shoulder, but continues working his rifle with his right hand. His friends keep the word about his shoulder quiet. They don't want to demoralize the others. But another gunshot can't be ignored. On the west side, Lieutenant Jennis is shot in the head and dies instantly. Littman tries to move a dead mule to shield Jennis's body, but it's too heavy. Sergeant Robertson lays a wagon cover over him instead. Shortly afterward, Tommy Doyle, the soldier next to R.J. Smith, is shot in the forehead on the north side. Private Haggerty is shot again and dies. For hours, the Lakota threatened to overwhelm the men in the wagon boxes. The marksmen north of the corral are particularly lethal. In fact, all of the soldiers killed are shot with rounds fired from this area. Slowly, the dismounted hostiles work their way clockwise around the corral, rushing toward the boxes. But each time they're beaten back. Conditions inside the corral are horrific. Aside from not knowing if you're about to die, the noise and gun smoke are overpowering. And remember, this is a corral. There's plenty of old animal crap inside the corral, which gets ignited by fire arrows launched by the hostiles. The smell and smoke are enough to choke you. Water becomes a necessity, and as the soldiers' canteens run dry, word spreads that there's water in 2 kettles slung under a wagon just west of the corral. The soldiers on the north side provide covering fire as 2 men crawl toward the wagon and drag the kettles back. Scoring some water does nothing to keep the Lakota at bay, though. By now they're charging from the east as well as the north, with hundreds more watching the battle from the surrounding hills. 2 more privates are wounded, one in the shoulder and one in the thigh. By this point, the soldiers have been fighting for their lives for nearly 4 hours. Lakota warriors have made it to within feet of the wagon boxes. It's not looking good. And so I think it's fair to say everyone was surprised at what happened next. A friggin' cannon shot. No, for real. Major Ben Smith, the fort's second in command, had been ordered to lead what we'd call today a QRF, or Quick Reaction Force, to save Company C. Fort Phil Kearny had also had some warriors show up outside the fort that morning, and observers on Pilot Hill could see the smoke from the wagon boxes. Major Smith led 100 soldiers and brought along a mountain howitzer toward the corral. He'd also brought along 10 wagons. Everyone assumed Company C had suffered severe casualties if it hadn't been wiped out entirely. The cannon shot had been fired from Smith's column to both disperse the warriors and let any Army survivors know help was nearly there. In his report, Major Smith wrote of the wagon corral, "Arriving there, I saw evidence of a stubborn and severe fight. The relief column is ecstatically welcomed by the men in the wagon boxes, and the post surgeon, Dr. Samuel Horton, gives every survivor a healthy swig from his whiskey keg." When everyone gets back to Fort Phil Kearny, the post commander says every man who fought in the wagon boxes will be awarded a medal. Casualty numbers from the wagon box fight are impossible to pin down. The Army lost 3 dead and 2 wounded at the corral, with another 3 dead at the side camp. As for the Lakota and Cheyenne warriors, in his report, Captain Powell estimated about 60 warriors killed and 120 more wounded. Since then, casualty numbers have ranged anywhere from 1,137 to 6. Whatever the human cost, the federal government had already decided on how they were going to deal with Red Cloud. It was going to be a lot cheaper to make peace than war. A peace commission had been created even before the wagon box fight, and in 1868 another treaty was signed at Fort Laramie. The forts along the Bozeman Trail were abandoned by the Army. It didn't matter, the Transcontinental Railroad would soon be finished, which would have made the Bozeman Trail obsolete anyways. But Red Cloud had won his war, one of the few times a native tribe was able to stand up against the government. The men who had fought together in the wagon boxes eventually went their separate ways. Max Littman, the German who had fought from behind a salt barrel, left the Army in 1869. Sam Gibson, the young private, made the Army a career and served out west for decades. John Jennis was buried at Phil Kearny's cemetery and was reinterred at Custer National Cemetery at the Little Bighorn battlefield. Today he lies next to the other fallen officers from Red Cloud's war, sort of a miniature officers' row in the cemetery. And what about Captain James Powell? Well, in the Phil Kearny Post returns for February 1868, there's a simple remark listed next to Powell's name: retired from active service for Special Order Number 6. After the Wagon Box Fight, Powell had been examined by the post surgeon, who advised that Powell's war wounds disqualified him from any further service. Powell requested leave and left Phil Kearny for good in October 1867. He took up farming for a bit and eventually settled with his wife in Peoria, Illinois. In addition to his physical wounds, there were rumors of mental health concerns. He spent the last 15 years of his life confined to his house in Peoria, finally passing away in 1903. James Powell was not killed in combat, but he certainly gave his life for his country. I want to take a moment and thank all the people who have supported the channel, whether it's through your emails, liking and commenting on the videos, which helps YouTube recommend these to more viewers, or subscribing to the channel. I can't believe there's over 30,000 history nerds like me who have the same wonder about the American West that I do. So thank you for the support, thanks for watching, and I will see you in the next video.